Nearly 40 miles southwest of Glasgow, Scotland, lies the port town of Ayr. In the 17th century, Ayr was home to a community of Covenanters, of Scots who, like their fellow subjects across the kingdom, swore a sacred oath to defend the Presbyterian Church of Scotland against the meddling of King Charles I. By signing the National Covenant in 1638, Scots in Ayr and beyond pledged to lead godly lives and submit themselves to the judgment of their local kirks and their communities when Satan's temptations overwhelmed them. But in the years that followed the return of the plague, the killing of a king, the outbreak of civil war, the occupation of the town by English soldiers, and the specter of witchcraft all tested their faith in God and in each other. Hello, I'm Dr. Jim Ambuske, and welcome to Revolutions in Retrospect, a podcast from Revolutionary Histories and Primary Source Media that explores the histories of the revolutions that remade the Atlantic world. On today's episode, we welcome Dr. Michelle D. Brock, professor of history at Washington and Lee University and author of Plagues of the Heart, Crisis and Covenanting in a 17th Century Scottish Town. Mikki, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Your book, as I kind of mentioned off camera, I sat with for a while because the Covenanters have always been very hard for me to understand in 17th century Scotland. I never felt like I understood these folks, their world, but your book really has helped me do that. And I thought to help our audience begin to understand and have a revelation, you might say, as I did, we might begin with some world building by looking at the place called Ayr in the 17th century. Where was this place in Scotland? What was it like in that period?
Yeah, as I often say when I get asked about air, when I first started working on this project and would tell American audiences that I was working on a book about air, they would often say, "The air?" Like that's quite a robust topic. Plus, you're a historian. I don't know what the N is. No, but Ayr, AYR, it was a port city that was on the southwestern coast of Scotland, and it was, a mid-sized robust borough, an urban sort of space that was surrounded by quite a lot of farmland and rural area. That, as I say, is this port town right up against the sea, really beautiful part of Scotland. And it looked across the sea to Ireland, so it abutted the Irish Sea. And the fact that it was a port city is really important to the story, of course, because it meant that Ayr, even though it is, again, this mid-sized borough, it was a really vibrant economic, political, and cultural space because it constantly had visitors coming from Ireland, coming from France, coming from the American colonies. So very much connected to this burgeoning Atlantic world as well as sort of the Irish Scottish world. So the seaside location is really pivotal. If you go to Ayr today, it was a really vacation destination almost for middling Scots for the bulk of the 19th and early 20th century. I have lots of Scottish friends actually who are from Glasgow who used to go to Ayr for their vacations. But certainly it was an important market center for Scotland, southwest of Glasgow on the coast.
So it's got this primacy of place on the southwest coast. It's a place of trade. It's a place of interconnection amongst peoples, but it's also a very religious site, as much as Scotland is in this period. Can you tell us a little bit about the role of the Church of Scotland in people's lives in this period? What was it like to be religious in mid 17th century Scotland in places like Ayr?
Yeah, so let me say from the outset that one of the things that really drew me to the history of Ayr, and of course, the question with the microhistory is why this town
Right.
above any other town? And as a historian of religion, I thought Ayr was really interesting because it had always had this position as a space of religious rebellion. It had been a place where Lollardy had sort of flourished in the late medieval period. It had been a place where George Wishart, who goes on to be a really important martyr in the early story of the Scottish Reformation, had preached. It's a place that purportedly had one of the most important episodes of iconoclasm, the
Mhm.
destruction of a sort of popish image in the early days of the Reformation Reformation. So it was, and it was an enthusiastic, I should say, adopter of Reformed Protestantism after 1560 when the Reformation fully came to Scotland. So it's a place that from the very outset was not just invested in religion, as virtually every other Scottish town would have been, as any medieval community or early modern community would have been, but a place that took religious convictions often to some level of the extreme, right? Really
Hmm.
embrace the changes wrought by new ideas and then, of course, by Reformed Protestantism. So a place with sort of zealous credentials from the very outset. And in Ayr, after the Reformation, as with most of lowland Scotland, the church really was at the center of people's lived experiences. We tend to think, I think, often erroneously, of Protestantism as being something that was very individual because it removed
Right.
a lot of the festivals and structures of the Catholic Church. But that's not actually the case. In early modern Scotland, communal participation in religious services was absolutely critical to identity and to community cohesion. So, an ordinary Scot, if you want to know what their day is like, their average day is like, average week is like in a place like Ayr, with this real commitment to the Presbyterian brand of Reformed Protestantism that was dominant in Scotland, it would mean on a daily basis you would be reading the Bible if you could read, or most people knew even if they couldn't read the Bible in total, they knew certain scriptures, they could recite the
Hmm.
catechism, they had some semblance of religious knowledge, and you were supposed to engage in reading and in prayer and in sort of contemplation of one's own godliness or the failings of godliness on a daily basis. You were supposed to really live your faith. And on Sundays, of course, it was really important to go listen to the sermon that was delivered on the Sabbath by your minister. And these sermons were really, really critical in early modern Scotland. They were the only regular form of mass communication. And that's where the minister could articulate not just rules for how to believe and behave, but could also update parishioners on things like the news of the day, right? If you're thinking about Scotland and Ayr in the context of, say, the 1640s, they're in the midst of a period of the British Civil Wars. And so news of what happened would also be announced as part of sermon time. Sermon going also, it seems very boring in some ways. Just go to the Sabbath and possibly listen to your minister like drone on. And I should say Scottish ministers were famously loquacious.
Yes.
They were like a typical professor too, go on for a long time. But there was also entertainment on offer, I think,
Hmm.
critically in these religious services, because one of the key things that the Scottish Church did after the Reformation is engage in the systematic discipline of parishioners who went astray. In every parish all over Scotland, there were these kirk sessions, which are local ecclesiastical courts that are tasked with assuring godly behavior among the community. And they were really concerned with what we might think of as kind of quotidian sin. So,
Hmm.
people caught in fields fornicating. There was a lot of fornication. The Scottish Kirk session records are just chock a block with people fornicating. They were concerned about people being too drunk and acting a fool because of that. They were concerned with people who were skipping out on the Sabbath day. You were supposed to go to church on Sundays. And if you didn't, an elder from the Kirk session might come and sort of knock on your door and be like, hey, where were you? Right? That sort of
Hmm.
church attendance was really mandated. So part of religious life was participating in this system of ecclesiastical discipline at the parish level. So when you were in church, not only would you hear the minister give his long sermon, and it was always a he, of course, women were not
Hmm.
ordained in the Scottish church until the second half of the 20th century. Um, I think it's quite late actually. It's like the 1960s when they can be elders, and even later when they can be ministers.
Oh,
So,
wow.
very male dominated profession, the Scottish clergy. But anyhow, you'd hear the minister give his sermon, and then you would see parishioners in your community who had fallen afoul of the dictates of a moral community having to make public confession, to perform public repentance. So stand up there in front of the congregation, acknowledge how they had sinned. Yes, I did fornicate with so and so from down the block, and I'm sorry I did it, or whatever. And then after that process, they would be welcomed back into the community. So this was sort of in some ways, moral discipline could be probably quite entertaining for people in the pews, but it was also an important lesson about how to live a godly life, how to engage in behaviors that not only encouraged your own religiosity, but the religiosity of people around you sort of committed to this pious community. So those are some of the things that an ordinary person would have experienced in Ayr as elsewhere in Scotland during the period.
Well, I mean, I love the description in part, and I love the book in part, as I said, because I feel like I understand these people in their world better than I did before. Because I think one of the challenges of understanding the Reformation is you can very quickly get tied up in trying to understand the theological disputes, or how much is this sort of line of thinking too much like
Mm.
popery and sort of
Mhm.
a retrojection back to the Catholic Church, and how much is the vanguard of radical Presbyterianism or Protestantism, and you kind of lose sight of the people who are actually experiencing this. John Knox is one thing, and he's a terrifying figure for many reasons, but then the people who are having to make these very public acts of contrition, and I can't imagine standing up and doing that on Sundays, it makes it much more of an intelligible and human world than I think we might often miss just looking at theological tracts. And that brings us to these people called the Covenanters. I mean, I guess first off, what is a covenant? Folks who are interested in the early history of New England might have heard that term, but it's a very powerful one in this period in Scotland. What does a covenant mean, and who were the people who describe themselves as Covenanters?
This is a great question, and you're right to actually point out the early New England connection because at its very core, a covenant without any sort of specific application to a national situation like that in Scotland. But at its core, the covenant is a pact, an allegiance, a deal one makes with God, right? If you are a member of the elect, you are, by the virtue of grace, part of a covenant with God. And that's a very old and critical scriptural idea. And it's why actually so many Reformed Protestants think about themselves as the new Israelites. They see themselves as living out the true covenant. So, this idea of covenanting theology, which is very much bound up with ideas about election, that is extant prior to the National Covenant in Scotland being signed in 1638. And you see the rhetoric, the language of the covenant elsewhere in the Reformed Protestant world, which I think is important. But if we're zeroing down on Scotland and what a covenanter means in our context, at the very basic level, a Scottish Covenanter is someone who ascribed to or swore to uphold the National Covenant of 1638. And the National Covenant was a document that was composed in response to Charles I, the British king at the time's imposition of the Book of Common Prayer on the Scottish Kirk, which rejected that prayer book because they thought it was too popish, because they thought it was too sort of distant from the system of Presbyterianism that was so dear to many people in Scotland. I think there's a famous line that Scots thought the English Book of Common Prayer was awful because it was popish, atheistical, and English. And I always ask my students which of these would have been the worst. But there was a lot of resistance to the imposition of this
Hmm.
Book of Common Prayer, partially because it hadn't been fully vetted by members of the Scottish Church, and it really did try to impose a very English system of worship, which was much less sort of pure in its level of reformedness than the
Hmm.
Scottish one on the church. So the National Covenant was a document that rejected this imposition of the Book of Common Prayer and articulated a very robust commitment to upholding the true religion. Now, one of the things about the National Covenant itself is that it's actually quite an ambiguous document. It doesn't spell out, here are the five main things you need to know about the true religion. And the reason that they don't do that is they want to have some people who might be sympathetic to Episcopalianism even
Hmm.
sign on to the document as a sort of attempt to preserve a distinct Scottish church that was not necessarily the same as the English one. So it's a very broad umbrella that the National Covenant actually has. It's a big tent. It wants a lot of people to come on board. But for most of the people, certainly those who composed the National Covenant and those who most vehemently fought to uphold it, they were staunch, diehard Presbyterians.
Hmm.
So sometimes people describe the National Covenant as a document that articulated people's commitment to Presbyterianism, but it is
Hmm.
more ambiguous than that in the actual text itself. But regardless, this document was composed in Edinburgh in 1638, and it was quickly sent out to all the parishes in Scotland. And there was a very specific way that parishes were supposed to read the National Covenant, this document, to their parishioners, and then ask those parishioners to quite literally swear to uphold that document and the true religion above all else against any incursions that might
Hmm.
damage the godly project in Scotland. And this really was a powerful communal act, right? To have your minister, who often the communities know, who often the communities trust, read the National Covenant and say, all of you here join me in the project of defending the true faith. And people, when I say they swore it, they literally stood up and raised their hands and swore to uphold it. We can think of it like a pledge or even like an oath to uphold this particular document. So, at the very basic level, a covenanter is someone who did this, right?
Right.
Which most people in Scotland did. What's actually really fascinating about Eyre is Eyre is an enthusiastic early adopter of the
Right.
National Covenant. There are some places, particularly in northeastern Scotland, that kind of hem and haw and are not particularly invested in doing this. They're getting the directions from the General Assembly, the governing body of the Church of Scotland, to do this, that every parish has to do it. The Scottish Parliament is on board. Everyone's got to get on board. But there are places that are holdouts, that they're not quite sure. They think maybe the National Covenant might be antagonistic to the monarch, and that's possibly dangerous.
Mhm.
But places like Ayr and places in the Southwest writ large were quick to jump on that bandwagon. Because again, I think that was drawing on this longer history of sort of religious resistance to various sort of things. So in Ayr, actually, it says very explicitly that not only did the men swear to uphold the National Covenant, and all the powerful men in the town actually signed the document that becomes known as the Ayr Covenant, women too were part of that ceremony. Everybody, it says very explicitly in the records that all people, men, women, both young and old, swore to uphold this document. And it's that act of swearing that made someone a covenanter. And what is really interesting for me and for this book project is I wanted to know what that act of swearing the National Covenant did, what it meant beyond that moment, frozen in time, where you made this compact to yourself, to your community, and to God. How did people then carry that commitment with them? How did it become a way that they understood their own lived experiences? And their own religious commitments. And the book really argues that Eyre saw the creation in the subsequent years and decades after the swearing of the National Covenant. It saw this development of a culture of covenanting, a
Hmm.
reinterpretation of all of these various mandates of Reformed Protestant theology and all of these practices, this reinterpretation of all of those things that had already been in place for a while through the lens of the covenant. So that is to say, when you sinned, when God's wrath was upon you, when things went bad in wartime, when you prayed with your family, all of those things were then seen as manifestations of either upholding that promise that you made to God and community and to Kirk, or deviating from it. So it really becomes this totalizing way of thinking about your experience of faith and community.
Right.
So for me, a covenanter is far less about the sort of strict high church definition of all these this political infighting among people at the top of the Church of Scotland, which you're alluding to there, Jim. And it becomes more about what it meant for that to be a core part of your identity and a governing force in how you understand both your own faith commitments and what was befalling your own faith community.
Well, I think what's so fascinating, as you kind of point out, is they swear the National Covenant in 1638, but as you say, it's kind of vague in some certain
Yeah.
circumstances, and that allows a lot of wiggle room for interpretation, but also to bring in everyone under a kind of a big tent. But then the oath, right?
Mhm.
And I think it's hard for folks these days to understand the significance and the power of an oath. I mean, of course, if we were to testify before a court, we have to swear an oath that we would tell the truth and nothing but the whole truth. But in that period, if you betray your oath, you are betraying God, and that's not great.
Yeah, absolutely. And not just, I mean, I think about this moment of people sitting in sacred space, a place where they had seen people married and buried. They had heard about the sins of their community members. They themselves had maybe had to perform one of these acts of public repentance. They had heard thundering sermons about God and about the devil and about Scotland and its future. And the space of the kirk, right? And in Ayr, it's St. John the Baptist, is the kirk that they're meeting in at the time the
Hmm.
National Covenant is signed, is imbued with all of this spiritual and communal meaning. The most important events in that town had happened in that space, and it's a space with a profound amount of religious history. So in sacred space, too, doing this oath, standing among your peers and, standing among the people who you've grown up with, I think that really matters
Hmm.
too, because it becomes an episode in the making of an explicit corporate identity. And I don't mean
Right.
corporate as in business, but corporate as in communal identity. And I think that really mattered to people. I think people in this period did take seriously the question of what do we owe to one another? And I think in some ways the taking of an oath is a commitment to that. And it's why when tragedy befell a community like Ayr, various myriad challenges of the 17th century, they first asked themselves, how do I, as an individual, make sure that my behaviors and actions don't harm the community? And how do we make sure this community functions as sort of a city upon a hill? Because what they're trying to do, what the Covenanting Project is trying to do, is not dissimilar to what John Winthrop was trying to do, or all those folks who came over in the context of the 1630s in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They wanted to create a covenanted community. And I think it's instructive, particularly for American listeners, to understand the project in Ayr as operating in the same way, particularly because it too, like the
Hmm.
Massachusetts Bay Colony, was born of political and religious conflict with a monarch.
Well, we've been talking about sort of communal enforcement of godly behavior, and um, but central to the enforcement, we might say, are the church leadership. And there's a gentleman named William Adair who is central to your entire book. In fact, you kind of frame your book around his tenure as the minister in Ayr. Who was he?
William Adair, man of mystery. No, we actually do know we do know a fair amount about him. But I will say that my husband and I sort of joked while I was writing this book that there was another man in my life, for the entirety of writing it. Because as you say, William Adair really is a core figure. So he is a man of the church, right? He's a minister. He came to Ayr right around the time that the National Covenant was being sworn. He was in Ayr around that time as sort of an expectant minister, someone who's soon to be admitted to the position of second minister of the church. But he's actually officially becomes in that position as second in command minister in 1639. And he stays in that role until 1682. So his ministry is very long. It's unusually long. It's
Mm.
44 years. It's longer than the average tenure of a minister. But he is also minister of air during this profoundly volatile period. So I became really interested in his ministry. Initially, I was interested in him because he just happened to be minister during this period that I thought was kind of bananas and full of exciting things happening and, regicide and pirates and witches and all that good stuff. But I became interested in him because it became clear that he was, from the very outset, someone with what I call kind of impeccable covenanting credentials. He was someone who was really engaged and enthusiastic about the project of the National Covenant and its implementation in communities. And he was really committed at quite a deep level, not just to the Presbyterian church structure, which he was, but also to ensuring that he was overseeing this community upon the hill. So I wanted to know what it was like to live under the direction or auspices of this kind of diehard Presbyterian minister for a generation, right? For 44
Right.
years. We don't know much about his early life. He was from a fairly wealthy landed family. He was the third son, so he wouldn't have inherited the sort of wealth and positionality that his brothers might have done. He was probably a soldier before he became a man of God, which
Mm.
is not uncommon, is certainly not uncommon for a man in his position. We don't actually know if he served any time, in the military. He probably was just being trained up to possibly be deployed to fight in the 30 Years' War, as so many Scots were. But
Right.
eventually he becomes a minister, and he spends his entire career in Ayr, initially as the second in command, but within a couple of years is at the helm, is the first minister of that community. And that's where he remains. And to me, he's just a fascinating figure because he has all these staunch convictions, and he is part of the more radical wing of the Presbyterian Church that gets into power in the context of the 1640s. But he's not inflexible in his thinking, and he was such an interesting example of how some of these figures that we brand as these religious zealots, these real hardliners, in practice, actually, they have to be pragmatic. They have to deal with the governing of a community in which there are different positions and different personalities, but also different pressures from out with that
Mhm.
community. So he becomes this almost lightning rod for the community. Apparently, a great preacher, really great gift in prayer. He was very fervent in his own personal faith. And also, fun fact about William Adair, one of the things that most interested me when I first started looking at his papers, he was an avid doodler in his time as a student. He went to the University of Edinburgh, where he trained in sort of theological training and otherwise. Scottish ministers were very, very educated, a high bar. But I have his school time notebooks, and he would, be
Wow.
taking notes on philosophy and Aristotle and all of this stuff that you'd be learning. But in the margins, he was just doodling. And actually, on some of the folios in his school time notebooks, we have pictures of people around him. We have lots of like weird dogs and other animals. There's also a picture of an entirely nude man, like a full frontal nude picture that William Adair doodled in one of his school books. That was a fun archival discovery. I turn it and you're like, oh, I always think
Hello.
and then you wonder, is this a self-portrait? Who is this? Like you have questions.
Yeah.
I did float with my editors. Could this be the cover of the book? We could have a little fig leaf or something to make it more appropriate, but we did get the hard pass on that one. So
Well, it's interesting, right? Because as you were talking about William Adair and you're studying his theology and you look and you see the more human side of him in these doodlings and whatnot in other instances, it kind of made me think about John Witherspoon, who's a century later,
yeah.
who immigrates from Paisley in 1768 to become head of now what is Princeton University College of New Jersey at the time, and he is often seen theologically and politically as a very radical figure, and in some ways that's true. But then you see this whole other side of him where he's doing land deals and he's
Mm,
encouraging Scots immigrants and whatnot to
yeah.
come over. And so you kind
Yeah.
of miss that stuff if you're so focused on, their interpretation of, the letters of Paul or something like that.
I no, I think that's exactly right. And one of the episodes in the book that really drove that home for me is in this period of quite a lot of tension in the sort of higher ups of the Scottish Church about how much they should cooperate with the king, either
Hmm.
Charles the First and then later his son Charles the Second. How much should they be willing to cave? Is it important that the monarch is also a staunch Covenanter? These sorts of questions that they were asking. He writes to someone who happens to be married to his sister. I think that's right. It's his sister's brother-in-law, something like that. There's
Right.
some connection via marriage, not a close degree of connection, but someone he's in contact with who is related to him by marriage. And he sends him this letter and says, "Listen, I know it seems like my side just wants division, but we don't. And I'm seeking you out as a brother." And again, these are people on different sides of the aisle, is how we would think about it sort of
Hmm.
politically today, who are trying to sort of maintain their relationship, their personal sort of
Right.
relationship and friendship through these really fraught times. And it's easy to lose sight of that if all you look at is the fact that William Adair didn't want to compromise with the king. And he had, as you say, these very traditional interpretations of certainly Paul and everything else. But in practice, radicalism didn't necessarily negate pragmatism on the ground.
Right.
And I think that's important for us to focus on.
And I want to come to some of those challenges in a second because we're dealing with plague, we're dealing with civil war, we're dealing with the occupation of Ayr by the
Yeah.
Cromwellian army, we're dealing with revolutions and restorations and rebellions, like everything you could possibly want in
Yeah.
history is happening in this
Yes.
period.
Yes.
But they are charged, ministers like Adair are charged, and the Kirk session are charged with enforcing godly behavior, what do
Mhm.
they consider to be ungodly, and how do they
Yeah.
go about? You've already alluded to some of the ways in which they enforce the behavior, but what are some things that one could do to get in trouble, and then how does the community itself enforce this
Yeah.
godliness?
And actually that's a really pertinent question, even for the subject of my book, which is how does allegiance to the covenants shift that, or how does it
Yeah.
inform what people think they are doing when they're enforcing godly behavior?
Hmm.
So the Kirk sessions are, as I said, they're set up after the Scottish Reformation in 1560. Margot Todd has a really phenomenal book, Culture of Protestantism, that's kind of the signature work on how these ecclesiastical courts operated. But they would meet sometimes on Mondays, sometimes multiple times a week, and they would hear complaints from other parishioners about bad behavior in the community. Or they would hear reports from elders or from the minister himself of people doing things that deviated from community standards, as it were. So, in one of these Kirk session meetings, they would, the whoever is the clerk of the meeting, writing down all of the information, would record today, James someone and Malcolm someone came before the Kirk session, having been reported to have been fornicating in the fields outside air last week, and now Jane is with child. This was a very typical situation. There was a lot of anxiety about sex outside of marriage, partially because of the potential demographic or community resource challenges that might pose, and also because it might be disruptive to communal harmony. So fornication cases are way up there, sex outside of wedlock. Now, they're really concerned about them, but really they just want to get these two people married, and have it be something sort
Right.
of sort of approved by the church, and to ensure that any future offspring of that coupling will be cared for by by the both partners and by the families, as opposed to being something that's a responsibility of the Kirk session, which was responsible for poor
Mhm.
relief and other things at the time. So they're really dealing with fornication. That's a huge one. That's probably the most common crime that you see, moral crime, in these ecclesiastical court records. Drunkenness, for sure, because of course it was seen that too many libations could lead to other sorts of unsavory behavior, namely fornication, uh, among among other things. Other sorts of sins where, you should not be playing golf on the Sabbath. You got to go to church. There was an enforcement against any sorts of rituals and practices that would seem to be reminiscent of Catholicism or a return to
Mhm.
Catholicism. So no holy wells. Do not go to any holy wells. Do not have a celebration at Christmas, right? Um, it's funny when people talk about like the so-called war on Christmas, because of course the original people who really had a problem with Christmas are certainly the Reformed Protestants, right?
Exactly.
So the Scottish Church actually had one of the earliest bans on the celebration of Yuletide. Again, because they didn't want people like getting drunk and partying on Christmas and then engaging in other sorts of behaviors, right? Other things that they were concerned with sort of policing, no what they called flighting, which are sort of verbal sparring between people in the streets. That's a problem because it disrupts communal harmony. Um, Certainly things like witchcraft, blasphemy, more serious crimes that might get referred up to
Hmm.
higher courts. Now, so again, these things are coming to the Kirk session either because one of the people who's on that Kirk session, the minister or elders, has heard about them, or other parishioners are coming to the Kirk session to try to adjudicate their own problems, right? Like
Right.
this, listen, my neighbor is drunk all the time and it is a problem. And can you come get this guy and sort of deal with him? Or my daughter has had sex out of wedlock with this man who claimed he would marry her, and so thus seduced her, and he didn't. And what do we do about that, right? So often it's ordinary Scots in Ayr, as elsewhere in Scotland, who see the Kirk session as a way to deal with some of their own
Hmm.
sort of problems. And what happens again after the National Covenant is that some of these sins, these deviations from proper behavior, get read as not just violations of what the Kirk sessions have long said people should be doing, but get read as violations of this covenant that they've both sworn to. Because the
Right.
covenant enjoined its swearers, again, to commit themselves to the true faith. And that implicitly and explicitly in the National Covenant required good behavior.
I I wonder what it was like for the clerk to sit there and just record some of these things. You just sort of wonder, like, after an hour or two, is he just like, oh my God, what's going on in this
You know,
community?
I have to say too, I am so my records are I was very blessed by good records. The only reason
Mm,
you can write a microhistory like the one I've written is because you have good records. And the fact that Ayr is a borough, right? It's an urban community. They keep good town council records. They show up in the Scottish Parliament, but also the Kirk session records are really well kept. And they're also really well kept by the minister. The minister keeps these books with him, and then whenever a new minister gets in charge, they get sort of handed over.
mm,
But you have the same clerk for much of the period, and he has very, I think, by the standard of 17th century paleography, pretty good handwriting, which was so much to my benefit. And he also reported details. Sometimes these clerks, they just say, yeah, so and so slept together, or so and so said some mean things drunkenly, but don't say what they are. Sometimes clerks don't give you all the details. But in Air, the various clerks actually over the period that I looked at, they wrote stuff down, which to me suggests again a real attentiveness to what people
hmm.
are doing and how they're deviating from behavior. So yeah, I mean, but it had to have been kind of entertaining. Like
That's
imagine
so. Yeah.
all you just get all the hot gossip. Like you are probably the most popular guy in town because these are closed things, these Kirk sessions meetings. And while a lot of these cases are require those who had sinned to perform public repentance, other of them were resolved with, fines or with private acts of reconciliation between folks. But the clerk knew all the gossip. And a study of the clerks of the Kirk session has yet to be written. So I have to say, I'd like to know more about these guys.
Well,
They
now, and
often were junior ministers, to be honest, but
if I recall correctly, right, many of those minutes of not only in air but elsewhere are now online to the
yeah,
National
they
Records of
are.
Scotland, right?
Annoyingly, they were not while I was doing some of the early phases of this research and also for my first book, but they are now, which is wonderful.
Well, and one of the, I mean, there were many wonderful examples from your book about people, about the clerk recording certain things, but one of the things that just made me laugh out loud is when, and I don't remember the woman's name, but one of the church minders went up and was asking why she wasn't in church on the Sabbath, and she goes, "What's it to you?" And
Yeah,
I just,
no, you do. I mean, these records are fabulous because they give you a sense of what ordinary people think about some
yeah,
of this, right? One of my favorite examples is later. It's in the 1670s, but this guy gets in trouble because he's going around town with a new dog and telling people this dog is called Trinity. And which is sort of a blasphemous thing to like name your dog the Trinity. And he claims that one of the elders said he could do it, and the elders like
sure.
I definitely did not, right? But it's that sort of texture is so fun, and it does give you a sense of things. I mean, there's another episode that shows up in the Kirk session records in this sort of a period of a lot of tension and chaos where people are having an argument about and this is after the restoration, about is your loyalty to King Charles or to King Christ, and they're
Uh,
arguing about this over beer, and it's the person who's sort of bringing up this is seen as sort of possibly leading into blasphemy. But wow, what a good example, right, of
yeah.
ordinary people thinking through some of the big questions at play.
Well, many different things force these folks to confront their faith in God and the community's faith in God, and whether or not God favors them, not only the restoration, which we'll come to here in a minute or two, but first the plague,
Yeah,
which hits air in 1647. It's not as
yeah,
bad as the one that hits, about 40 years earlier, but
yeah,
still, the plague is the plague. That's
yeah,
not great.
yeah.
What does this tell us about how they have to, how Adair, the community, all these folks, how does it test their piety, and how do they develop a kind of reflective response to it that
Yeah.
that speaks to what you call a covenanting ethos?
Yeah, absolutely. So it really is this episode of Plague that got me interested in air in the first place. So all early modern communities dealt with various waves of plague. And Scotland had, particularly on the western coast, a really intense period of plague in the middle years of the 1640s, so 1645, 1646. And when reports of the plague start coming into air in the summer of 1647, they have some sense of the damage that might be done by this because they've heard about other communities along the West Coast that have been decimated by these various waves of the plague. So they immediately know what sorts of actions they need to take because again, they've heard about this and it's decimating of other communities. So as these rumors come in, they close the ports, right? They start implementing kind of very early modern variants of social distancing rules, right? Which will be familiar to all of our readers. But they also, particularly William Adair, decides that if the town wants to avoid the consequences of the plague, if they want to avoid what happened elsewhere in the 1640s, if they want to avoid what happened in Ayr 40 years prior, as you say,
Right.
then they need to address the root cause of the plague, which was perceived to be by William Adair the wrath of God, the sense that God was angry with this community for not living up to the mandates of the covenants, the goals of a city upon a hill, and as such had his hand laid heavy upon the people there and was
Mm.
causing potential sickness and other things. And so, in order to alleviate the wrath of God, Adair convinces the community, and particularly the men of the community, to engage in a really unprecedented process of communal repentance. And what happens over the course of about a week is that the 17 different sort of crafts and professional societies of the community organize themselves by those groups. It's an urban borough. It makes sense that they get together according to profession. And these communities, a group of these groups of men meet and they talk together and they meet with the minister and they talk about their sins, what they've done wrong, both individually and as a group. And then they make these mass confessions in front of the entire congregation over a series of days. So let me give you a concrete example of what this would look like.
Sure.
The sailors have the most interesting confession for a whole host of reasons. It's certainly the longest, but they're a really important group, right? The sailors in this port city. And they get together, they stand together in the church, and they talk about things that have happened while they are abroad. Right. And some say, well, while I've been abroad, I had sex with women, both married and unmarried women. They talk about that. They say, while I was abroad, I was tempted to take part in the mass. Right. And that's a really
Oh.
appalling thing for someone who's a Presbyterian to do. Or while I was abroad, I drank too much and I blasphemed and I neglected prayer, all of those things. And they make these confessions internally. We know this because we have some of the minute books from these various professional
Mhm.
organizations. And then they essentially read these confessions to the entirety of that congregation. Every single professional organization in AIR does this. The 8 official sort of incorporated crafts and guilds, but then all the other professional organizations like candle makers and messengers of the town and so forth. And even the Kirk session confesses to their sins. Even the town council does it, right? Um, and what's really interesting to me about these confessions, just as from the perspective of a historian, is they're not formulaic. And you might expect these guys to be very formulaic? Are they just repeating what William Adair is telling them? Are they just saying, if you go after a group like the sailors, you're like, yeah, what they said, but not as bad, as opposed to, but these are very sort of bespoke confessions that I think really reflect that they took this seriously. And why did they take it seriously? Because the recent plagues were things that they knew about and they really feared because they
Mhm.
trusted their minister and sort of providing this course of action for them. And the thing that is most interesting to me about these confessions as a whole, and they go on for, like 30, 40 folios in the minute books, right? Front and back.
Wow.
It's a really massive recording about all of this. And it's recorded in the Kirk session records as well as the minute books of these various crafts, which to me really shows that the Kirk session and the clerk and minister all thought it was really important to write this down, right? To talk
Mhm.
about what they've done to try and lift the wrath of God. All of the crafts, all of the groups confessed to breach of the national covenant or the Solemn League and Covenant, which was another covenant that had been sworn in 1643 in conjunction with the parliamentarians as part of the project of fighting the British Civil Wars. But they basically say we've broken our covenants. And all of these sins are evidence of how much we've neglected that promise, that oath that we had
Right.
made. And as such, God's angry, and so they're apologizing for that. They're repenting. Um, and after the whole thing is done, William Adair gives this sermon of thanksgiving, and says, "Hey, only almost no people died during this wave of plague because of the work that we've done over these mass confessions. Now, it was probably also helpful that they closed the port and engaged in, some level of social distancing, although they weren't social distancing in church, which is really fascinating. But from the perspective of Adair, this is real evidence of God's favor because of what they had done. And other churches, other presbyteries in the area note this and are like, gosh, this was such a good example of godly behavior in response to this sort of crisis. But the reason that I think it tells us a lot about the culture of covenanting, beyond the fact that they all confessed a breach of covenant, is that that practice of having sworn an oath in 1638 and again in 1643 provided the community a blueprint to in some ways do this
Mm.
again vis-a-vis these vast confessions. So it's a remarkable episode. um, it's actually an episode that I think is really reminiscent of some of the sort of acts of revivalism throughout southwestern Scotland in the context of the 17th century that were really influential in the making of the First Great Awakening in the American context, right? So I think
Right,
I
right.
think you see this borrowing of these sorts of Jeremiads almost, even in the other side of the Atlantic at some point.
What did it mean for the community members to essentially know everyone's sins? Does that strain relationships? Does that
Yeah.
cause discord, disharmony?
So one thing that's frustrating about these records is what is recorded are not the individual sins, but what the group collectively says that they did.
Ah,
So now the records say the sailors got up and confessed both personal sins, and then here are their corporate sins. So they talk actually what gets recorded are the sins of the group, but no doubt people heard other people's sins, and you do. I mean, it's a good question. I've never actually thought about that. Like, what happens if you're a wife of one of the sailors, right?
right.
Like, you're just sitting there, and you hear all of this, and women are remarkably actually absent in this whole affair because they don't make public confession because it's all the professional organizations that
Hmm.
did. It's almost certain though that after these happened, the families went home, got back together, and talked about these things internally, right? That
Right.
women made their own sorts of confessions in that context. So I think it may certainly have caused tensions, but I think the community as a whole broadly felt that it was necessary to undergo this purifying fire, as it were,
Hmm.
to avoid the wrath of God. And it was successful, which I think only led to further commitment to this sort of covenanting course of action, this covenanting ethos.
Well, one of the places that women do show up a lot, as you say, is in records pertaining to fornication and
Yeah,
illicit relationships, but also witchcraft.
yeah,
And just sort of think about those in tandem for a second,
yeah,
because not only are they dealing with the plague, shortly thereafter, down south, Charles I is executed. The Scots declare for Charles II, but that doesn't make a whole lot of difference at this point because a civil war is on.
yeah.
And now, so they have to deal with the problem of regicide. They have to deal with the problem of an invading army of Cromwellian forces who not only invade Scotland and win significant victories in places like Dunbar, but then are occupying these important port cities like Ayr. How does the occupation, the regicide, the occupation then of air present challenges for people like women,
Mm,
both in terms of relationships they may have with English soldiers and the consequences that the Kirk session sees coming out of that, but then more importantly, there's also an interesting aspect to witch hunting here, where there's an
yeah.
intense period before the occupation that kind of abates a little bit and then picks up again.
Mm,
Tell us a little bit about women's experiences in this
yeah.
turbulent time.
Yeah. So let me kind of tell that story through the perspective of one woman and see if we
Sure.
can't sort of build out that world. So one of the most interesting figures, if we're thinking about the context of witch hunting in air, is Janet Sawyer.
Hmm.
And Janet Sawyer is a woman who, had by all accounts kind of an unsavory reputation, was sort of known for being loud, for potentially cursing people. She had, basically engaged in a lot of disputes with neighbors and that sort of thing. So she's sort of in some ways kind of a central casting figure as someone who might be likely to be accused of witchcraft. Janet Sawyer is accused shortly after the regicide of in the years just after the regicide of Charles I in 1649. And she's accused at a moment where much of Scotland is undergoing a kind of witch panic. Because the regicide, even though, Scottish Covenanters were no great fans of Charles I, it was really disruptive that this decision had been made by folks down in London, the most radical of the radical of the radical members of the parliamentarian faction, had executed the king, which really was seen as this unfathomable event, even to people
Hmm.
like the Covenanters who had, broadly speaking, been quite suspicious of that particular monarch, and at one point in the context of the wars, had fought directly against him. So the regicide is really disruptive. It almost seems apocalyptic. And the regicide happens at this moment where the most radical Scottish Covenanters are also in power. And they're in power in terms of the church, they're in power in terms of the state. The secular magistrates are by and large radical Covenanters, the clergy are. And all of these folks see this moment of chaos, really, after the regicide, as a time when it is really important to clean one's own house. So you have the Scottish Parliament in 1649 pass all of these pieces of legislation that reaffirms the church's commitment to eradicating sins and the state's commitment to eradicating sins like adultery and other things. But witchcraft is also on that list. And that really leads to this moment of kind of a witch panic in 1649. And Janet Sawyer in Eyre gets caught up in this, right? And witchcraft is
Right.
seen as sort of one of the worst sins even someone who's covenanting can make, right? Because it's an explicit rejection of your covenant with God by making covenant with the devil, right? And actually, this is the moment when people start to talk about the demonic pact, which is a feature of most witchcraft allegations in Scotland, as not just being a pact with the devil, but a covenant with the devil. So even that language of covenanting bleeds into the witch trials in really interesting ways. And Janet Sawyer is accused of doing this. She's also accused of lots of other things. She's accused of, maleficium, harm to horses. She's accused of sort of being able to predict ill things to come to others in the community. She gets accused of sort of cursing an elder and causing cursing a member of the Kirk session and causing a great bale of wool to fall on their head and kill them. I mean, she gets accused of lots of different sorts of things. Um, her and these initial allegations against her happen on the eve of the Cromwellian occupation, right? So she's getting accused in this moment, right on the eve of the Cromwellian occupation. But her case is not actually tried until 1658. And that's because even as you have some of these witchcraft panics happening in Eyre, the community's attention and the ecclesiastical establishment's attention is quickly diverted by the fact that there are literal armies of soldiers marching
Right.
into the community. And so any sort of witch hunting that they were gearing up to engage in gets sort of set aside. So Janet Sawyer gets let out of jail and is like, just hold tight for a bit, right? While we figure out what's going on. And we actually don't know what happens to her in that interim. She does actually end up going back to jail after the Cromwellian occupation starts to sort of calm down, and the trials begin again. She actually does get executed at the end of the 1650s. But the Cromwellian occupation had really intense consequences for the women of Ayr. So
Hmm.
Cromwell's army, certainly what happens in Scotland is nothing like the level of what happens in Ireland, which really amounted to war crimes there. But in Scotland, it was still a government by garrison, right? It was still a sort of martial law to a large degree. And Ayr was home to one of Scotland's largest citadels. So tons of soldiers are billeted in Ayr. Some of them are living in the sort of army's quarters, but some of them are quartered with ordinary people,
Right.
right? And the reason this has such a major consequence for the women of the town is one, if you have a bunch of soldiers quartered in your home, hell, Janet Sawyer could have had soldiers quartered in her home. We don't know, but she might have done. But some of these women had soldiers quartered in their home and had to cook for them, to mend their clothing, right? To help sort of provide for them as part of that forced quartering on that community. And this would mean that some of them missed church because they were meant to go to the Sabbath day, but instead they were, getting demands from the soldiers who were quartered there, fix my shirt, make me food, whatever, right? So that's one way that it disrupted ordinary women's lives, is a sort of labor of caring for those soldiers who are billeted upon the town. But also, and this is what you're alluding to with the fornication piece, there
Right.
are a lot of local women in Ayr who are engaging in sexual acts with the men who are in town. And I think most of those acts, I should say, were probably consensual, right? They
Hmm.
have this influx of like young men at a period in which a lot of their own soldiers had been gone, a lot of their own men, I should say, had been gone and fighting the wars to the south as part of the context of these sort of British Civil Wars. So a bunch of men who are there who are, as I say in the book, kind of situationally single, although certainly not all of them actually are single, and they, some people fall in love, right?
Hmm.
They broadly speak a common language. It's a funny thing to have a foreign army quartered in your community, but it's not an army that's all that foreign, right?
Right.
They're essentially Protestant, right? They more or less speak the same language. They'd fought together, right? Scots and English parliamentarians in the context of the early years of the British Civil War. So they're strange bedfellows in this way, and as I say, literal bedfellows in other instances. So, and I should say some of the relationships between soldiers and Ayrshire women probably weren't consensual either. There are some
Right.
appalling cases of sexual violence. But regardless, the Kirk session is like, oh my God, we have this wave of fornication on our hands, right? People are just sleeping with soldiers left and right, right? It's really hard to control the populace in this way. And because of that, they start hearing all these rumors of women who've had these relationships, and they start calling them before the Kirk session in batches and saying, okay, we hear you have had sex with this dude, this soldier in this regiment. Do you know if he's married? That was the first question they wanted to ask these women. Do you know if he's married? Is he a free man? That's the language that they used. And what they meant was he single, or did you just engage in an act of adultery? Because
Hmm.
the way that adultery was understood is both parties were guilty of committing adultery, even if only one of them were married. Right. So the
Oh,
church really needed to know, was this run of the mill fornication? We've seen this song and dance before, or is this something really serious and we need to deal
upgrade
with
the
it?
charges. Yeah.
Upgrade the charges. No, exactly. I mean, it's
Yeah.
a much different penalty for adultery. That if you commit adultery, you have to stand in sackcloth for repeated days before the congregation. If it was really serious, if you had been a multiple time adulterer, you could even be put to death, although that was rarely used. It was one of those statutes that was passed again in 1649 that said the death penalty could happen. So that's a serious deal. Versus fornication, it's just like, okay, well, try to find out if this guy, if he's not married, don't do it again. Maybe consider marriage, right? Perform public repentance, whatever. But it wasn't, I actually think the Kirk session was sort of flexible with the women during this period to some degree, because they did understand that these were very sort of strange circumstances. In some cases, the penalties are less than what they would have previously been. But the civilian experience of occupation was really disruptive, and especially for the women of the town. There's no
Right.
question. Um, there are some fascinating examples in the records that I talk about in the book of these love stories, right? That essentially become love stories
Hmm.
between soldiers and the women of Ayr, where these English soldiers, some of them decide they want to marry these women. And in order to marry them, they have to lay down their weapons and say, basically deflect in some, or defect in some ways from the army. But most important to the church, they have to swear the covenant. In order to be a member of that community and to marry one of the local women, they had to swear the covenant, which shows you again just how pivotal covenanting had become for communal identity. And it served almost as a bulwark for keeping that community identity intact, even amid all of these soldiers in town, some of whom who are Baptist and some of whom who are Presbyterian, and or some of whom are Puritan, right? They're not all sort of run-of-the-mill Scottish Presbyterians. There's a lot of variety in the parliamentary forces that Oliver Cromwell brings into Scotland.
Well, yeah, I remember one of the records saying one woman was talking about her suspected lover, and she said something to the effect of, "Well, he's Anabaptist, but he's okay."
Yeah,
We
no,
can.
there was a lot of worry, particularly about Baptists in the area. There was some reporting that they might be sort of clawing away converts from the Scottish Kirk. I think actually that was probably unlikely, but what that record that you're pointing at Jim shows us is that ordinary people were quite aware of these confessional differences, actually,
Yeah.
right? You have some women who sleep with Englishmen and get accused of being Puritans, which theologically that's a lot in common with the Scots, but the ecclesiastical system that they adhere to is very, very different. And Puritans are quite threatening to a Scottish church that's really founded on this court-based hierarchy, right, of kirk sessions and
Right.
presbyteries and synods and that sort of thing. So yeah, people were living amid this profound uncertainty and this change in this era of almost apocalyptic fear. Um, and that did lead to a lot of policing of sort of women's bodies, which were seen as potential vectors of disruption for the
Hmm.
community.
Over the course of this period, William Adair has been shepherding this flock and dealing with these controversies and these challenges in kind of innovative ways. But near the end of his tenure, and in fact, the end of his life, the monarchy is restored. Charles II takes the throne in England again. That presents a whole host of new challenges. What what does it mean for this covenanting community to face the restoration of Charles II, who has his own ambitions
Mhm.
for religion, for law, is particularly interested in making sure that everyone knows the king is back and this time for good after an experimentation with Commonwealth and republicanism. It seems like Adair, from the end of your book, he is really trying to again be pragmatic, but in some sense, events and community matters overtake him in ways
Mm.
that he might not have expected as a younger man.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, you know, with the restoration, the project of sort of Charles II and also the people around Charles II was to restore everything in Scotland back to the sort of pre-1638 period, to erase all of the changes that had occurred after the signing of the National Covenant, and to make sure episcopacy was once again the order of the day, so that the king could have control over the Scottish kirk, which was really something that was anathema to people like William Adair, who had spent his entire clerical career rejecting that very thing. But
Right.
this is important. Scottish Covenanters were by and large not Republicans. There is no thread of republicanism in this period in Scotland that's commensurate with what you have in England. It's
Right.
really interesting in that way. So it's not that Adair doesn't want there to be a king, but what Adair wants is the church to have independence from that monarch. That's really important, this rejection of monarchical control of the ecclesiastical establishment. So Adair has to deal with this question repeatedly when the government of Charles II tries to impose a series of sort of oaths, of tests, they're called test acts, where they require members of the ecclesiastical establishment, members of the clergy, but also sort of secular magistrates to swear their allegiance to the king. Okay, that's one thing. Adair might have been able to do that, but also to recognize the king's supremacy over the church. And Adair was unwilling to do that. Now, he was allowed to stay in his ministry. There was an ecclesiastical settlement that allowed ministers who'd been in their position prior to the regicide, or prior really to the beginnings of the British Civil Wars, to stay on board. So he was allowed actually to stay in his post, where a lot of other ministers in Scotland, if they weren't willing to conform to these new rules, were basically cleansed. But he's allowed to stay in post. I also think having a powerful family helped with that. But he had to deal with the fact that, his second in command was ousted, and they imposed the government imposed an Episcopalian as his sort of colleague minister, second in command
Uh-oh.
of the church. And that was really disruptive, right? But strangely enough, William Adair seemed willing, not happy about it, mind you, but willing to try to see if he could work with the guy. And I think it's very much my sense that he wanted to keep government eyes off air. I think he wanted to
Mm.
try to avoid any further military occupation of air. That's not entirely successful in the 1670s, early 1670s. There's more troops that come to try to tamp down on any violence or any sort of church meetings that are happening outside of the official church, which the government really becomes concerned about. So Adair's trying to walk this fine line. He wants to hold on to his covenanting principles, and he's really explicit about that. But at the same time, he knows that if he wants to keep things smoother for his parishioners, he can't do too much to draw the attention of the government. The reason that that's so fascinating is because, in some ways, the radicalism that he had in his youth, that torch gets passed to his parishioners who say, screw this. We're not going to go to a church service that's run by this Episcopal intrusion, as they call Minister George White. We're not going to countenance this. We're opposed to this. We've grown up our whole lives saying we're rejecting episcopacy. We're rejecting monarchical oversight of the kirk. We can't do this. And so they actually start attending these conventicles in really massive numbers by the time you get into the 1670s. And a conventicle is essentially an open air meeting where they practice Presbyterian services and stick to Reformed theology that happens outside of the Church of Scotland. So in some ways, he actually has parishioners not rebelling against him, but rebelling against any sort of finding of common ground or attempting to accommodate really the changes wrought by the restoration. So it's this very difficult period for him. And I do think you bring up his age, and I think that really matters, right? By the time
Yeah.
the restoration has come, and by the time really things get even more intense in the 1670s, Adair is in his 50s. He's probably in his 60s by the time he was born in 1614. So whatever that math is, he's approaching his 60s. And he's not the sort of young firebrand that he was anymore. But I will say that in the end, though, as much as he does try to accommodate to some extent, it's clear that he's networking with other ministers who've been booted from their posts and sort of helping them arrange things. So I do actually think he's probably doing some cloak and dagger stuff to try to get around the ecclesiastical settlement that was sort of brought by Charles II. And in the end, actually, he keeps refusing to take the Test Act. He keeps refusing to sort of recognize the king as the head of the Church of Scotland. And eventually he gets finally kicked out from his job in 1682 for that refusal. So he never acquiesces on that point, the point of that separation of church and state, which was so formative to his identity and formative to his identity as a Covenanter
Hmm.
specifically, that he's never willing to reject. And he has to leave his ministry in 1682, and he dies 2 years later in 1684, before another revolution was on the horizon in
Right.
1688, which would see Presbyterianism restored. So his life is sort of really interestingly bookended by some of that.
And he's, if I remember rightly, he's one of the only, is he one of the only ministers from that period who has a monument? Is that
He's
right?
Yeah, absolutely. So after he dies, his son basically commissions the building of a monument, which is affixed to the side of the church, the Church of Ayr, the old Kirk of Ayr, as it's called. And this is not the original church where he preached in. That was taken over by the Cromwellian soldiers, and they had to build a new one. But regardless, the church that he spent the latter part of his career in, yeah, a monument is built to him. It's really powerful. It shows him kneeling in prayer. And this was almost never done, the building of these monuments to ministers. I think, if their names are inscribed, they're typically on Covenanter monuments or
Hmm.
memorials, which are all over the southwestern part of Scotland. But he has this really, really powerful one that captures his image. It's the only picture we have of him, unless that new drawing was a self-portrait.
That's
But
the
who can
drawing.
say? Who can say? He was young when he did that doodle, and that doodle a little too hairy to have probably been William Adair. But we'll set this aside. I don't know. Anyway, the stone monument is one of the only ones, and I think obviously the wealth of his family, probably the relative wealth of his family, helped get that set up. But
Yeah.
it's a powerful thing, even to see now, to see this figure sort of kneeling in stone.
Well, and I think that makes a great place to end it by encouraging listeners to go see that monument and contemplate his life, the events we've been talking about, and kind of good lesson in being firm when you must, but pragmatic when necessary.
Yeah, I mean, what a book to write over the last, several years between pandemic and other sorts of crises. Yeah, it's an interesting meditation on what community means in those moments, I think.
Well, Mikki, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us on Revolutions in Retrospect. I'm Dr. Jim Ambuske, your host for this episode. Thanks to our producers, Dr. Lynn Price Robbins, Patrick Long, and Jeanette Patrick. Please share the show on social media and help other listeners find it by rating and reviewing on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. Revolutions in Retrospect is a joint production between Revolutionary Histories and Primary Source Media.